Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Being Alert to Pension Scams, a Guide for Trustees and Scheme Managers. Pension scams were a growing threat even before the coronavirus darkened our collective doorstep. The numbers are absolutely staggering. Shortly, we'll learn that more than 50% of members would fall for a scam if offered one, and it's possible that more than £60 billion has been lost to pension scams so far. Layered on top of this is the economic chaos caused by the pandemic. The scale of the damage to pension savers is still unknown. The furlough scheme and other interventions have created a soft landing for many people, but we are far from clear about the impact to employers, jobs, and future employment prospects. What is clear is that financial criminals, including pension scammers, thrive in an environment of distress and fear, a condition which many savers may find themselves in now or in the months to come. Trustees will want to be on the highest alert for scams, and today's webinar is addressing exactly how you can be prepared and protect your scheme members. My name is Rachel Pine, and I look after content for the PLSA's conference and training offerings. I'm delighted to introduce today's panelists, who will discuss the latest information on pension scams, best practices for trustee boards in preventing scams, and policy news and initiatives aimed at mitigating scam activity and uptake. With us today are Margaret Snowdon, OBE, President of the Pensions Administration Standard Board and Chair of the Pension Scams Industry Group, Peter Flanagan, Chair of DHL Trustees, and the PLSA's own Caroline Escott, Senior Policy Lead on Investment and Stewardship. I have a couple of polling questions to start us off. They're going to pop up on your screen, and if you can answer them, that'd be really helpful. So the first question we have for you, with regard to transfer value requests and the pandemic, we've seen more requests for transfer values. We have seen fewer requests for transfer values, about the same number as usual, or we're not sure. And I'm going to share the results with all of you. So it looks like transfer value requests are the same, about the same as usual for about half the people, and fairly even, it seems very few are seeing more requests. So we have one more poll for you. The second question is your fund currently providing access to independent financial advice for those looking to transfer out? We provide and pay for our scheme members to have access to financial advice. We have an approved list of financial advisors. We are discussing doing one of the above, or we're not thinking about providing financial advice. And you can see that the majority, so 53% are not thinking about providing financial advice, and about 90% or 19% are already providing and paying for scheme members to have financial advice. So these are things we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to take these down and introduce our first speaker. Now we'll hear from Caroline. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Rachel. Yes, so before we move to Margaret and Peter talking about the practicalities, I'm just going to give a little bit of context around what the PLSA has been doing and seeing in this area of activity, and also what some of the policymakers have been doing, and just giving a whistle stop tour through that. So as with every policy issue and with every issue generally, the PLSA policy team and across the organisation, we see ourselves as having two roles. So the first is to try to shape the policy environment on scams, as with any other issue, and the second is to provide practical support and guidance and work with other industry groups like PLSA, support and guidance, for instance, giving you direct access to experts like Margaret and Peter during a call such as today. And when we think about scams from a governance process, we really think about supporting members in their roles and TT aspects. So the first is trustees' responsibilities to educate and raise awareness amongst their members, as they would for any kind of communication, of the danger of scams, and thinking about how they tailor the member journey to make sure that it's emphasised, the messages are emphasised at key points in the retirement journey. And then when they receive a request, making sure they have a robust process in place to protect members against scams wherever they can. And of course, we recognise that in reality, most trustees will be delegating the day-to-day stuff to administrators, but of course, it's still something that trustees need to very much engage with and be involved with. And as Rachel said, COVID-19, of course, has meant many more people have been put into what you can almost see as sort of a more vulnerable situation. So if you think about the FCA's definition of vulnerable consumers or vulnerable savers, and you think about physical health and mental health, of course, those will in many cases.
Give me 1 second, Caroline.
Differently. Hello, Rachel.
I'm so sorry, Tina. We're having a little bit of trouble hearing you, and we wondered if we could try turning off your camera.
Yes.
Might improve your sound quality. So sorry.
No, don't worry. Always happy to do that. It means I can get into my pajamas instantly as well. There you go. Right. Is that helping? I'm also moving this closer. Good. I can see someone said much better. Lovely. Very good. Yes. So scammers, of course, are taking advantage of the fact that there are many more people in vulnerable stress situations. People who you wouldn't have considered vulnerable a few months ago now suddenly might be. And we've seen policymakers become increasingly alert. So they'd always done quite a bit of work since pension freedoms on the different regulatory regimes to try to ensure that consumers and savers were as protected as possible. They've really stepped up a notch. We've seen a joint statement from TPR, FCA and MAPS. We've even seen Guy Oppmann do a statement about reminding savers to avoid knee-jerk reactions. We've seen lots of different bits of guidance issued from TPR, issued aimed at trustees, new resources for savers, lots of different COVID-19 resources, both online and in paper format, popping up as well. We know that TPR, in its regulatory approach and its supervisory regime for master trusts, has also been asking lots of master trusts very quite granular questions to just make sure that they are doing whatever they can and that they've got the right processes in place. And of course, and I know we'll be discussing this a bit later, we've also seen the FCA's recent announcement on its measures on DB to DC transfers, and in particular the ban on contingent charging, which is something that the PLSA had called for. And when we speak to our members, and I acknowledge that PLSA members are probably at the more engaged end of the spectrum, but we know that they've been doing a lot of good stuff as well. So when we surveyed them back in April, by that stage already 1 in 5 of the people who responded to the survey had changed their processes to mitigate the risk of members being scammed. We actually had a finding which is a bit surprising to us, but analogous to the stuff that came up in the first poll, which was that very few of our members said they'd seen greater instances of members being approached. I imagine this might change. We will be running this survey again as well to see how things are ticking along. And even in terms of anecdotal evidence and what we would consider to be good governance, we know that many more of our members have been having more regular trustee meetings as well. Even though the initial few weeks might have seen a flurry of focus on things like the actual payment of benefit to members, making sure that that continued despite the operational challenges, a focus on thinking about covenant strength, on how you deal with market volatility. We also saw many schemes very early on, when I say upping their communication to members, really making sure that they communicated with members in both an online way, using paper-based approaches, making sure that there are onsets added to their additional, annual benefit statements as well, training their telephone consultants, and a lot of very good stuff. We will, as I said before, be running a survey again, and we always welcome member views and experiences at any time. Aside from the policy stuff and monitoring that and liaising with policymakers, we've also been producing quite a bit of practical support. So that includes our top tips for LGPS, DB and DC schemes on how to deal with COVID-19. And I'd encourage everyone to log on to our website to look at those. We've also produced something around top tips for savers. So just making sure that we support the messages that many schemes are putting out to savers, which is, stay calm where possible. Make sure that if you are about to make a fundamentally life-changing, retirement savings changing financial decision, that you seek appropriate financial advice and guidance as well. We continue to support and welcome the excellent work of PSIG and as well as liaising close with policymakers and members throughout this situation. So that's all I'm going to say for now. I look forward to the discussion in a bit, and without any further ado, I shall hand over to Margaret.
Thanks, Caroline. Well, I think firstly it's a bit of a shame that we have to keep reminding ourselves about pension scams, but scammers aren't in lockdown, and as always, a crisis tends to bring them out in droves. I'll cover a few areas in the next few minutes. First of all, I'll try and give you an update on what we see with scams and what impact we think coronavirus has had, but as well, importantly, what you as a trustee or scheme manager should be doing, and a little bit of an advert, but what PSIG is actually trying to do to help. I think the key takeaway really is that we are trying to prevent scams before scammers get their hands on people's savings. So this. There we go. So people tend to be a little bit confused about scams. What is a scam? How can you know if you spot one? Well, I can say there's a very good definition of pension scams in the PSIG code, and I suggest you check that out. It is actually also agreed by the FCA and the TPR. But importantly, scams aren't always illegal, but they always involve misleading people about an offer. And it's important to be able to distinguish between actual fraud, because it can only be reported once it's happened, and what we actually do, which is we look at suspected scams, not actual ones. We can't prove that some transaction is a scam until it's actually happened. So it's vital we stop it before then, because honestly, afterwards is way too late. You've heard already that 50% of people would fall for a scam. That's work done by the regulator. So we need to help those people, even though all the scams awareness is out there. People still don't quite get it. And we estimate from research that we did that 5% of transfers are potentially scams. So there's quite a lot we need to do. We've also found that 90% of transfers go into SIPs, which are self-invested pension plans. And this is reinforced by the recent FCA review of DB transfers. So a little bit more on numbers. Based on the number of transfers that have happened, I think it's quite likely that 1.5 billion went to scams in 2018 alone. And as you've already heard from Rachel, total scams so far could exceed 60 billion. And just to put it into perspective, 60 billion is around half of what the UK government pays every year on state pensions. And you could imagine the outcry if half of state pensioners receive no pension for a whole year. That's the likely extent of scams. At an individual level, people who are scammed can lose about 22 years worth of savings, and the average is around about 82,000. Lots of people lose an awful lot more than that. But we keep also hearing that there are limited reporting to action fraud, and I think that's partly related to my earlier point, which is action fraud is really set up to deal with fraud that's already happened, as opposed to us having suspicions about the numbers. But one other key point is it takes quite a long time to find out if a scam's happened, and I believe the average is around about 7 years. So that's a long time from a transfer to somebody discovering that something hasn't quite worked as they'd hoped. So looking at the impact of COVID, there's been an impact so far, but I think there's a lot more to come. And as we heard earlier, people in lockdown are actually more vulnerable than usual. They're at home all day, they're worried, they're struggling, they're stuck to their mobiles, and they're exposed to social media ads. I was a bit surprised to see the stats, but we've actually seen a bit of a decrease in transfers, sort of March and April, although they are now beginning to increase. And I think the decrease that we saw was because people were a bit distracted. And honestly, so far, coronavirus itself has been the biggest and the fastest opportunity for scammers. We've all seen adverts for fake masks, fake remedies, donations. We've even seen fake trace and track texts to collect information, personal information. But pension scams related to COVID are coming. I don't think we should kid ourselves on. And I think it'll hit us just when administrators are trying to recover from the backlog of focusing on priority work. We've certainly been looking at adverts from mainstream brokers, scaremongering about the coming recession, talking about company failures, and saying now is the ideal time to take advantage of investment opportunities. And we see an increase in requests to access pensions early, and I think that's the key for what goes forward. I think we'll see a lot of interest in getting access to cash, and I think that's why we see a big increase in SAS registrations, and that's because they've got a loan-back facility. So I think it will all be about cash. And I couldn't talk about scams without mentioning claims management companies. They're very active. They're issuing all sorts of requests for information in an attempt to bring a case against the scheme for a past transfer. And if you want some guidance on how to deal with CMCs, you might like to look at our scams code. So what should schemes do? Well, first of all, I would say follow the code, carry out due diligence in all transfers. And it doesn't mean full due diligence everywhere, but focus on the grey transfers, which are probably no more than 20% of transfers that you receive. Importantly, we would like you to talk to members where there are red flags, because that really does make a difference. Between 25 and 100% will actually change their minds when things are pointed out to them. Some won't, but a lot do. I would also say that a discharge form isn't a silver bullet. It can still be challenged. So make sure they're as strong as you can do, and do actually mention the risks of scams. And I would say also help members find a good advisor. There are more than 3,000 IFAs out there, and it's quite difficult for members to spot a good one or a bad one. They all look pretty much the same. So help them. And when you think the FCA is saying that more than 50% of transfer advice they've looked at is unsuitable, they have banned or will ban contingent charging on DB transfers from October. Should have done it a long time ago. But there's also things like the PFS ethical code for advisors. I think about 1,000 advisors now have signed up to that. And trustee selected advisors, which we've heard a little bit, a bit more on. So in terms of what PSIG is doing, first of all, I'd have to say the pensions regulator, is now encouraging people to use the scams code, the PSIG code, and that's great. It's been a bit of a long battle, but we've got there. But we've got to keep it live. Our last version was a year ago, almost to the day. So we're looking at producing another one. We've been waiting for legislation to change, and it's been slow as treacle, trying to get anything through. So we're doing some research. We have our industry forum, which is very good, with about 46 participants who share intelligence on potential scammers. That's very valuable. But we'd like to extend that out to a broader base than we do at the moment, but that takes quite a bit of work. It's quite an endeavour for a voluntary group. And we also want to simplify the code. We are working with the pensions regulator to help define key scams indicators, and we've also been working on changes to the law. And I noticed Brian asked a question on changing the pension law to restrict the statutory right to transfer. Well, that's something that we believe is about to be tabled. We've put recommendations into both sides of Parliament, and there's quite a bit of support. So we're doing quite a lot, but at the end of the day, I have to say that scams cost everybody, they cost schemes and they cost members, and we really have to try and do everything we can to stop them before they happen. So that's all I've got to say, and over to Peter.
Okay, thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you for all the work that PSIG do, which I, for one, find very helpful. I am Peter Flanagan, for those of you that don't know me. I'm a PMI accredited professional trustee, and as Rachel said at the start, I'm the chairman of DHL Trustees Limited, which is the trustee of the DHL Group Retirement Plan. That's a £6.5 billion pension arrangement that's got about 150,000 members. The plan has both DB and DC sections, and it has in-house admin. I've been asked to share with you some of the actions DHL Trustees Limited has taken to try and combat pension scams. And I'm very happy to share these ideas with you and answer any questions you may have about our processes and procedures. I intend to do that with the help of 7 slides. I'll start off with a bit of background, then we'll talk about what we do when we get a quotation, what we do when we get a payment request from the UK, not around suspected scam, but a normal request, then payment to make request to make a payment overseas, or where we've got some reason to suspect a scam. And then I'll finish off by talking a bit about communications. So firstly, a bit of background. I'm not sure how much I agree with this quotation. The worst regret we have in life is not for the wrong things we did, but for the right things we could have done but never did. My belief is that the trustee of the DHL plan certainly would much rather delay a transfer and be sure it's appropriate than pay a transfer quickly only to find it's a scam. And to avoid making that mistake, due diligence is key. And more now, as scammers get more sophisticated and there are more of them about. So let's look at some of the things we've done to change our process and hopefully to avoid ever being in that situation. Firstly, and a little controversially, we don't accept third-party letters of authority. So if we get a third-party letter of authority that's from an independent financial advisor, for example, which is basically their form with a scrawled signature at the bottom, we won't accept that. We will send our own letter of authority to the member, which is GDPR compliant. And together with that, we will include a scam questionnaire, asking questions about how the request has come up, who will advise on the transfer, this sort of thing. We'll make sure we only send FCA authorised advisors quotations, and we'll always, in our correspondence with members, we'll advise them a little about scams, point them to the TPR website, and send them a copy of the Scam Smart leaflet. Currently, of course, we're also sending them the COVID-19 template letter. So that's what we do on quotes. I said I'd talk a little about payments. We have an approved list to whom transfers may be paid immediately, which we regularly review and update. So if there's a payment request and it's to a scheme that's on that list, we can make the payment quite quickly. The sort of schemes you'll see on that list are approved master trusts, public sector pensions, and also schemes where we've made 5 previous transfers where there's been no concern. We will, whoops. We will, for any scheme that's not on that approved list, we will make a third party that we employ call the member to try and establish whether any scam activity has gone on. Where the member won't take the call, or we haven't got the ability to call them, then we will raise a red flag letter, or if the call itself generates some suspicions. Any payment overseas or a UK case where we have reason to be suspicious, we'll check online the receiving scheme, the administrators, and the employer. We'll also send a questionnaire to both the member and the receiving scheme administrators, and we'll try and obtain all the necessary documentation, the Trustees and rules, the accounts, and registration approval documents. We'll then consider all of that information and issue a red flag letter explaining any concerns that have come out of that due diligence. Margaret made the point about indemnities and disclaimers, and we always ensure that our indemnities repeat the things that are in the red flag letter. So it's an indemnity that is signed, and we've made specific reference to any concerns that we've had and the suspicions and the fact that we've issued a red flag letter. So to finish my part, I'd like to talk a little bit about communications. We regularly remind members about scams, and I think with COVID-19, any communications that are being sent out at the moment should also mention scams. We're ensuring that we put a short article into our trustee report because, as Margaret mentioned, we're worried that there may be a spike when people start coming out of furlough, and unfortunately a lot of people are expected to lose their jobs. And therefore our trustee reports this year, which will go out in Q4, will have a short article that refers specifically to scams. And we try also to make sure we remind members of scams when we're issuing benefit statements. Overall, our communication policy is moving from paper to electronic, and we're wanting to do more and more. We've now got a new website that members can access, and that's a good place to put stories about pension scams, sort of vox pops, where people are reminded about the problems. And we've also now released an app for mobile phones, and again, that's a great way where you can contact members who've registered for the app and just give them a little reminder about what a pension scam is and how to avoid them. I think Nicola Morgan made a very good point that the recent change in contingent fees is something that's coming in October, and that may lead some trustees to decide that in order to avoid a spike in transfer requests before that October deadline, it may be worthwhile making some communication with members that pension scams may become more prevalent before that change. So thanks for that, Nicola. So that's me done, and I think we're now going to start working through those questions, Rachel.
Yes, thank you, Peter, Margaret, and Caroline. Excellent. We have a lot of questions, so that's very exciting. I'm going to start with one that a lot of people have asked something about it. You know, we asked at the beginning about schemes providing financial advisors. So a question is, you know, does the panel think sponsors and schemes should put in place arrangements with an IFA or a panel of trusted IFAs to direct members who are thinking about DB transfer, who should pay. And also another question about, we can move them all together, which is, who has the liability for what that, scheme selected or trusted IFA tells a scheme member. So maybe Margaret, maybe we can start with you and we can then move around.
You're on mute, Margaret.
There we go. Sorry, I was giving a great answer. Now I'll give a terrible one. I think it's a very useful tool. It won't be for every single scheme. I think it depends on volumes of transfers, etc. Number of people you've got coming up to age 55, for example. Given this year's going to show a major spike in that demographic. I think it's very good. There is a bit of concern that responsibility passes. Actually, I don't think it does. I think the responsibility remains the financial advisor, who is actually regulated and expected to give suitable advice to his customer, etc., etc. But I think there's a lot of scaremongering that that by choosing an IFA, the trustees are making themselves into some sort of financial advisors, and I think we need clarity on that, because again, it's another attempt to help people where regulation could potentially put up a barrier, and I think that will be unfortunate. But most schemes who are selecting an IFA are using consultants to help them do that selection. And I think that helps to at least give some degree of professionalism and some separation from the trustees.
Very good. Peter, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's something for trustee boards to consider. And one of the things that they need to consider is the difficulties if they don't put forward recommended IFAs. There have been a lot of examples where particular schemes have been targeted, particularly in the event of a company failure, and members have been pretty much left for scammers to pick over the bones. And that is something that I think trustees have to be aware of and have to have a good reason for taking a decision not to put in place an IFA panel or help their members in those situations. So I think it's balance depends on the scheme, on the trustee board, on the particular circumstances, and different judgments could be right in different circumstances. But it's certainly something that should be considered.
Can I just quickly come back, because the question was also asked about who pays for advice. Again, that's got to be down to the trustees. But if we cast our minds back about 10 years to the Incentive Exercises Code, it was quite clear that bringing in an IFA, which it recommended, would be at the cost of the employer if an exercise was generated by an employer or by trustees. But if an individual just decided off his own back to go for a transfer, then he would be expected to pay. But some trustees would prefer to pay and then have the assurance that they're not sending their members into harm's way. But that was a broad rule of thumb. It depends on whose interests are met most by the transfer.
If I might just chip in there, Rachel, very quickly. So just from my perspective, so we know that TPR does like to see some kind of signposting to financial advisors, some kind of list of recommended advisors. So it can be a helpful option for trustees to consider if they're thinking about managing that risk from a regulatory perspective as well. One thing that we know some schemes are doing quite successfully is start the communications about financial advice options relatively early on to try to build that level of comfort and trust amongst their beneficiaries around the kind of financial advice that they might expect to receive. And the final thing that I just wanted to mention, because I saw it pop up in the Q&A, was this question about the role of guidance and whether or not schemes are doing enough to signpost consumers, savers, to guidance. And I actually think that we've seen a lot of good work from schemes in terms of signposting to pension wise. I think they're doing it more and more often. I think they're thinking about different ways of doing it as well. And I think that, you know, my feeling would be that they're getting on it. So I don't necessarily have any concerns from that perspective. Some of the leaflets that I've seen going out in annual benefit statements, for instance, I think that's all very positive. There are broader policy issues in terms of the advice gap and access to guidance in these areas as well. But that's a bigger issue, probably not for today's session.
Very good. I should add that Caroline is joining us by phone now, as we had some audio problems with her. And Margaret, I have a question for you about scammers charters, which is something that you've been opposed to. How could a change in the law to limit transfers that show sign of a scam, how could it work without actually being a scammer's charter?
I mean, that's an interesting question, and it's really why government's been a little bit reluctant to introduce a change, because I hear all the time it's very difficult to clearly define what would be a sign of a scam. I think it's entirely possible. I think the important thing is to keep it up to date rather than say it's too hard to do. I don't think it's a scammer's charter. I think scammers are already clever enough. They know more about pensions regulations than I think a lot of us do. So I don't think it's a good enough reason for not doing it. But I do understand why people fancy that.
Right, very good. There was a question here about, and I thought Peter might have a view. Do you think that TPR and the FCA are working with one other organization as well? TPR and the FCA and HMRC are working together enough to eliminate scams? Are they joined up enough?
Well, I think we've seen an improvement during this crisis, actually, with TPR and the FCA working together around some of the guidance that's been issued. I'm not sure whether HMRC was involved in that, but certainly TPR and FCA were, and I think the DWP as well. And that's been welcome. So they have actually worked very closely on the guidance that's been issued during the COVID-19 crisis. We have got a one-to-one supervision arrangement with TPR currently, we being DHL Trustees Limited, and we find they're very helpful and very willing to get involved if you've got a suspected scam. So I think I would urge administrators and trustees to make that call and reach out to TPR if they come across a suspected scam, because they're very helpful.
Right. Margaret, did you want to add to that?
Peter's right. FCA and TPR are working a lot more closely together. For the last couple of years, they've been collaborating on scams, and as Peter says, mainly around messaging. And I do agree it's a good thing. There is Project Bloom, which I sit on as well, and it's FCA and TPR, and that's all they're there to do is look at scams. So they are coordinating, but it takes a long time to move some of that machinery, which I think is a little bit of a shame. But PSIG is involved with Project Bloom because we're actually bringing in a lot of non-legislative things, and they're actually easier to do. So we're trying to fill the gap in a sense. But yeah, it's good that they're working together. It's a shame that HMRC isn't, because they really ought to be in lockstep.
And if I may just add to that, so yes, I agree that TPR and FCA have been working very well together. And just to come in on the HMRC thing, so you know, there's been a lot of back and forth between HMRC and the pensions industry in recent years. And what was, I think it was a couple of years ago, HMRC said, no, it's absolutely up to the trustees to do the due diligence on this. You cannot think that just because a pension scheme is registered, that it means, you know, everything's good to go and you should be very happy. And that's fair enough. One of the things that the PLSA would like to see happen from an HMRC perspective is for HMRC to be increasingly proactive in liaising with overseas regulators when it comes to transfers into overseas pension schemes. And I know that HMRC is actively considering that, but we hope that COVID-19 is going to see a resurgence of activity across all the regulators and HMRC as well in particular.
Right. And Caroline, just another question for you. Discussing HMRC, various policymaking organizations, how do you think policymakers' approach to scams will evolve in the light of COVID-19?
So we've already seen lots of uptick in activity, which has been extremely positive. I do think one thing, I'm aware that we're running out of time, one thing that is probably worthwhile very quickly highlighting is something that Margaret referred to, which was the pension schemes bill. So as an avenue, as an opportunity for the pensions industry and policymakers and the minister in particular to work together to think about what more can be done to try to minimise the risk of pension scams. So we've already seen some clauses in there about the statutory right to transfer. You know, we'd like to see something in there maybe about the creation of an authorisation regime for smaller schemes, for SASs, those schemes which we know are high risk, and maybe bringing back this concept of a pensioner trustee, but some kind of independent trustee with a whistleblowing duty that would have to be on the boards or sort of on the governing bodies of certain schemes, as well as the HMRC checks that I was talking about earlier. So we'll work with the rest of the industry to try to influence the pension schemes bill, but I think that's worthwhile highlighting because I think policymakers are particularly keen to listen to the industry at this moment in time.
Right. I was going to say, we're a minute over, but I wanted to ask one more question. Is everybody happy to stay an extra 5 minutes? And those of you listening, obviously you can hop off, but we just have another 5 minutes. There are just so many questions. There was some news for all of us on last Friday. The FCA announced a ban on contingency charging for DB transfers in the vast majority of cases. Now, the PLSA supports this, although we wish that the ban would come into effect before October. What do you think the impact of this will be on the availability of financial advice? And I'm hoping each of you can chip in on this as a last question. So Margaret, how did you
I go first. I welcome it. I welcomed it when it was talked about a year ago. Been asking for it for several years. So pleased to see it. Disappointed that it's still out there as something that will happen in October. You know, there clearly are mixed feelings out there about it. But I think it will actually restrict financial advice, I think, which I'm hoping that it will improve the quality of what remains and get rid of some of the poor advice that's been out there. So the jury's a little bit out. I do worry that we've given a gap that scammers can manipulate in the meantime, and I'm sure they'll be already plotting how they can get around the contingent fee issue. But the real idea about contingent fees is to improve the quality of advice and making sure it is actually suitable for the individual and not suitable for financial advisors.
Right. Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, I echo those thoughts. I agree with Margaret. It's a good thing. We're happy that it's happening. Wish it would happen sooner. I think that the gap between now and October gives scammers an incentive to and those that give bad advice an incentive to push on. If it does lead to a reduction in advice going forward, that's a good thing, because the people that we will be doing without will be those that are tempted towards bad advice. So I think that it's a pain that I'm willing to suffer.
Thank you. Yeah, and just one sort of final thing that I think it's worth considering is we've already seen DB transfer specialists leave the market. And that's actually because in many cases of the lack of PII cover, either it's not available or it's not available at an affordable price. And we have seen with every FCA utterance on DB transfers, that market for PII tighten even more. So I imagine this will have a similar hardening, shrinking effect on that. So I think it will be interesting to see how that works. But we definitely supported the ban on contingent charge. And there is, of course, the carve out in those exceptional circumstances, if the member has very poor health, for instance, or if they would be at risk of significant financial detriment elsewhere if they were not able to undertake a transfer. So we think it's a really, really positive step. It will be interesting to see how it interacts with PII market movements and exactly how small that pool of advisors who can and are willing to do DB transfers becomes.
Great. Well, thank you all for that. It's all we have time for today. The speakers have kindly agreed to answer some of these extra questions. We have a lot. So we'll add these answers to the webinar page when we have them, and you can check back and see that your question gets answered. Many thanks to Margaret, Peter, and Caroline for joining us today, and a big thank you to all of you who joined us in the audience. We hope to see you again soon.